Prayer is a topic that is covered, as I said, extensively in the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. In fact, prayer and praying are mentioned 1,171 times in the Bible. That many times, you know it's got to be important. The Jews, who the Bible, the Old Covenant was written to in particular, and even the New Covenant, which was written by mostly by Jews too, Jews were quite familiar with prayer and the form of prayer and what prayer was in communicating with God. They were so familiar with it. And the disciples, being Jewish also, frequently saw Jesus praying to his Father. So they saw this firsthand. It reads in Mark chapter 1, verse 35, we read, "And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed." The disciples, being Jewish, grew up with a Jewish perspective of prayer. And these New Testament writers, Paul, John, Mark, these are Jews also. They grew up knowing the Jewish perspective of prayer. This means that they all knew that they had a right to pray to God. It was a huge part of their synagogue services, and they believed also that God heard their prayers. How do we know this? Because in Psalm 65, verse 2, we read, "O you who hear prayer." They're speaking of God. God, oh God, you hear our prayers, is basically what is being said here. Because of this, they would not badger God with prayers like the pagans would. I mean, most of them, if they're doing it correctly. Pagans would continually recite and scream their prayers over and over and over. For instance, we get a great example of this in the Old Covenant in the book of 1 Kings chapter 18. It's when we have the prophets of Baal going against Elijah at Mount Carmel. Let's read part of that right now and see how this goes. And check out what the pagans, how they are praying. That's what we want to focus on. In 1 Kings chapter 18, we're going to start at verse 26 and go through 29. And here's how it reads. "And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made, and they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on and on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention." That's how pagans prayed. Now, even Jesus addressed this showy way of praying. In Matthew 6, verse 5, we read, "And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward." Showy prayers, screaming and stuff, putting on a show, that's not the way you pray. Let's go back to this passage in 1 Kings, and now notice how Elijah prays compared to them. And it reads, and again, we're picking up 1 Kings 18, starting now at verse 36 and going through 37. And it reads, "At that time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. And I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, that you have turned their hearts back." Now, do you notice what's going on? Elijah simply talked to God. He's not shouting, he's not screaming or anything. He simply talked to God. He didn't shout, didn't dance around the altar, didn't do anything. He simply talked with God. Going back to the ancient Hebrew word that is used here, where it says Elijah said, it's the word Amar. And Amar means to simply just speak like I'm doing to you right now. That's what Elijah did. Jesus taught his disciples about prayer also. In Matthew chapter 6, a very familiar passage for everybody basically, having to do with the Lord's Prayer. But look what he said next as he's in here. In Matthew 6:6, Jesus tells us as he's teaching them about to pray, but when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, when Jesus said this in the first century, Jewish homes were very small, quite confined, not big, massive rooms like we have today. Little privacy existed for families. Notice that their prayers were not made just in the temple or in the synagogue or at certain gatherings. You see, you don't have to go to places like this to pray. Jesus was telling him you can perform prayers right in the quietness of your own home.
Support the show. Become a donor at evidenceforfaith.org/give.